Next, we're going to talk about the MnDOT Transportation Hierarchy Tool. And this is really a continuation of the lab presentation I did on the context categories. It's something that's attached to the context categories and is part of the requirements and is part of what is covered in the new CompleteStreet handbook. So with that, we'll dig in a little bit. And so as a teaser, a challenge that we have is balancing user needs. That's what we're asked to do is to say, based on context zones, we understand here are the activities that are going to happen from that. And now we need to take that and come up with a balanced design. And how do we do that? And who do we prioritize? And so the answer is modal hierarchy guidance. So, each modal user group has their own priorities, and sometimes they're at odds. And what we'll find out is, and many of you already have, is it doesn't all fit. When you start to design something and you say, I've got to accommodate pedestrians who need to cross, I've got to have a dedicated bicycle facility, got to have a transit lane and good bus stops, and also, got to have that turn lane at the busy intersection. It doesn't always all fit. So we need to make some decisions based on modal priorities. And so what are modal priorities? These are some early examples of kind of this modal priority idea. These are all from cities, and that's noteworthy. But what they usually look like is something like pedestrians are the top rung or tier, or whatever it is on the inverted triangle. And then it's either bicycles or transit are the next priority down, depending on who's doing it. Sometimes they're together. And then it's vehicles, and then it's trucks, and then maybe you add in parking or stormwater management or something like that somewhere in the mix. And that was sort of the urban version of Complete Streets when, mid early 2000s when this started happening. But what this doesn't do is this doesn't address the varying context types, our 9 land use context categories. It doesn't really work. This might work in an urban area, but it doesn't really work at a statewide scale. So that's when MnDOT entered in, and I mentioned this earlier, it's repeat, but with their MnDOT land use context types tech memo, 10 years ago or whenever that was, and say, okay, we've got these 9 land use context types that we want to incorporate in our version of a modal hierarchy tool or user priority tool. So how is that being done? And so when we looked at it, there are examples from other places who have started to do this to sort of lay some good groundwork before us. And so there were some statewide examples. Florida was one that was an early adopter of some version of kind of what we ended up with, a user hierarchy. Other states like Oregon had a lot of tables, and then you get to the cell that applies to you, and then it tells you to go to another page where there's another set of tables. There's all these like nested table guidance, which, it was detailed, but really hard to use. Like you're kind of bouncing around pages a lot. So how can we simplify that? And this is sort of the last piece of it then for what we're doing with the Complete Streets guidebook. So we take the 9 transportation hierarchies, land use transportation categories that we have. We take our 9 land use categories and we've added what we're calling a baseline transportation hierarchy, a baseline set of user priorities. And what this says is based on this typical, average, whatever you want to say, this version of a land use typology, here are the users that we would expect and their relative priority based on relative vulnerability, but also based on the type of demand for activities that sort of land use might generate. So these are baseline, and it's kind of a big deal. Like, just let it sink in. What this means is in an urban core, that is your modal priority. So planning for prioritizing pedestrians, bicycles, and transit over vehicles and freight, right? But this isn't where we stop. This is a baseline, and the reason it's a baseline is because we're Minnesota and we've got these 9 different land use categories, and we know that we need to do our job. We need to use engineering judgment or planning judgment, depending on what stage in the game you are, and look at what's happening at our project at a specific detailed level. So we've come up with this process for the Minnesota Complete Streets guidance that kind of takes you through that. And so step 1, project review, that's what you just did. in the last case study. It's digging into the details of your project and trying to understand what the existing conditions look like, what's driving transportation activity, where do people want to go, where are there crash problems, that sort of thing. Then step two, applying the context categories. That's where you ended in your case study, right? You started to mark out, okay, this is suburban, this is residential, urban residential, what have you. And now what we're learning on in step two is that does come with that baseline user priority or that baseline transportation hierarchy. And we're only half done in the process. So step three is, okay, we've got this baseline user priority, but we're going to do our homework. And we're going to say what factors or characteristics are out there that would cause us to adjust this for this project. So for instance, we're on Snelling Avenue right now, and maybe most of it we said is an urban residential. And we do our homework and we look and we say, okay, it's not on the bike network. That doesn't mean that there's never going to be any bikes there, but it's not identified as a bike route. So is it really appropriate for this to be high, or maybe it should be something else? And I'm totally making that up. There are segments of Snelling that are on the bike network. So that's not necessarily the answer. Hints, because you're going to do that in a little bit here. So that's the type of activity. I'm going to give you some more on that in a minute here, but we do a user, do that user mix adjustment, and then you document it and take it home. And when Nissa earlier in the day was talking about expanding the CompleteStreet's reporting process to cover scoping and planning earlier, this documentation, the idea is that it can stay with a project from inception all the way through opening day, whereas it gets handed off from group to group. You've got this CompleteStreet's reporting that you can build on, and you can see, okay, this is what the planner did before me, or this is what they were thinking during scoping. And this is going to talk more about that later, but the documentation is a big deal. So I'm just going to go through a slide on quickly each of these steps on summarizing what's in your handbook. But the project review, this is what you just did, right? So you got some practice with it, looking at what the user demand is, who are the people out there living life that we expect to be there, doing the data review, where are the crashes, and what does safety look like? And by the way, I have a separate rant that I'll save for later, or maybe it's Sonia's rant, but when we look at safety, it's multifaceted. And what that means is we need to look at both frequency and we need to look at severity. So it's both. And there's different ways to think about that, but finding out where the hotspots are in terms of safety, looking at existing traffic control, other stuff. Is there a weird skewed intersection that we know we're going to have to wrestle with, or a big hill, where there's sightline issues, or whatever the case may be. And then there's demographic review, and some of you got into that and some of you didn't, but taking a look at who's there and who's likely to use it, and what does that mean if there's a large transit dependent population in your project area. What does that tell you about your design? Tribal jurisdictions, you could do a whole 2-day training on coordination with tribes, and that exists, and you should look into it. But identifying and understanding whether or not you have tribal coordination needs is important. And then, activity centers, where's the university, where's the residential, what's happening with the stadium? So it's that sort of thing. And you all just did it. Oh, okay, here it is in words. I know that was hard to read. Yeah, okay. And then we identify the context zones, and we've been talking about that, and that does come with the baseline transportation hierarchy. And I just want to reiterate, I spent a lot of time, talking about how it's important, maybe prolific. It's a baseline. This isn't where we stop. What would be a disaster in my mind if somebody took this tool and said, okay, I got to here and I'm done. Now I know what my user practice. That's not what we're saying, but we are trying to provide that guidance as a starting point. This is a repeat of a slide that Nissa had. How did we determine the baseline transportation hierarchies? We looked at the relative user vulnerability. So people walking are more vulnerable than people in a car, et cetera. And what the expected activities as a result of that land use type might be, and kind of came up with that priority, but it's not a science. These aren't set in stone, and that's why we do the adjustment. And then for the user mix adjustment, this is really where you do your homework. This could be, depending on the stage or scale of your project, an afternoon of desktop research, or this could be 12 months of a project scope with a whole consultant team and community engagement and all of that. This is a big process where You need to go talk to people and understand what's happening. What does the St. Paul district plan say for Snelling? Have they identified priorities? Is the water tower going to go away and become an apartment building? Whatever the case may be, you really need to dig into that and use that information to adjust the modal priorities for the specific project. And in the guidebook, there's this big matrix that is in an appendix. And if you go to the online version of the guidebook, these are linked, so it kind of helps. But essentially what it's saying is MnDOT has their family of plans. There's all the MnDOT modal plans, and each of those has information about your corridor. Statewide, they're identifying things like priority walking areas, bike routes, oversized, overweight networks, and you need to know all that for your project area, and that will affect your user hierarchy. So those resources are there. And here's just an example of what that looks like. So in this example, the solid colored boxes are what the baseline was, and the cross hatching is what the modification was. And I think this is Pamela and Sonia's work from some project. I don't know, but good job. So in this case, they shifted the transit category from medium to low, presumably because that area didn't have transit. So that's the type of adjustment that we're talking about. Transit's common, bikes are common, freight is common. So those are some of the things that can often change. And then we documented. You do have official reporting requirements that NISA has kind of talked about and is going to show again later. For the cases of our project today, we're going to give you some forms, and these are in the back of they're in the back of this presentation, whatever we're on. I think it's 5. This is sort of the end result of the activity that we're going to do. So you'll go through and fill out this table, select the context category, and then check off your project specific modal hierarchy, and then give the rationale. And that's what you would put in the CompleteStreet's reporting form if this was a real project, is not only am I changing the baseline project hierarchy, but here's why I'm doing it. And then there's also a spot for future considerations. Look, there's this weird intersection. I didn't solve it at scoping, but I'm going to note it here so that when this thing gets into design later, they can put it in the RFP or whatever. It's that sort of a thing. So that's what we're going to do. Quick and dirty, that's the overall of the modal hierarchy adjustment bit of the transportation hierarchy tool. That's a whole lot of big words, but I'll just pause there.